The clock on the wall in the West Wing reads a few minutes past 9, but the hands might as well be stuck in a moment of unprecedented political anxiety. For the first time in his tumultuous political career, sources tell us that aides to former President Donald Trump are reportedly stepping in to manage a candidate they feel is increasingly unmanageable. The dynamic inside the room has shifted from one of deference to one of quiet, desperate intervention. This isn't just another day on the campaign trail. It is, according to those with direct knowledge, a full-blown operational crisis, with the very structure of the Trump operation buckling under the weight of its principal's mood. We are looking at a political machine that is, for the first time, trying to figure out how to steer the driver. The atmosphere, we are told, is thick with a tension that hasn't been felt since the darkest days of the January 6th hearings. Staffers, once eager to execute the former president's every whim, are now finding themselves in the unenviable position of having to say no. They are filtering information, delaying newspapers, and strategically timing when to deliver certain pieces of news, all in an effort to prevent what one insider described as a public detonation. It is a high-wire act of political psychology performed without a net, and the stakes are nothing less than the future of the Republican Party. The man who prided himself on being the boss, the ultimate decision-maker, is now being managed like a volatile asset, a situation that history tells us is fraught with peril for any leader. And it is into this already explosive atmosphere that a seasoned voice from the conservative establishment has chosen to drop a political grenade. George Will, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and a man whose intellectual heft has shaped modern conservative thought for decades, has sounded what many are calling the most urgent alarm of his career. He isn't just criticizing policy differences or debating tax cuts. Will is issuing a stark warning about the very fabric of American governance. When a thinker of his caliber, a man who has dined with Reagan and shaped the intellectual underpinnings of the modern GOP, decides to speak, it is not a mere opinion. It is a seismic event in the political landscape. Will's alarm, detailed in his latest column and subsequent television appearances, cuts to the core of the Trump phenomenon. He is not merely worried about a loss at the ballot box. He is warning of a systemic rot, a decay in the standards of public discourse and political accountability that he believes Trump represents. For decades, Will has been the voice of restrained, principled conservatism. To hear him speak now with such urgency, such palpable dismay, is to understand that a significant portion of the American right believes the ship is not just off course, but taking on water at an alarming rate. It's a warning that reverberates far beyond the Beltway cocktail parties, reaching into the living rooms of millions of voters who have trusted him for years. But what, exactly, has prompted this intervention from the staff and this thunderous warning from Will? To understand the present crisis, we must rewind the tape and examine the operational history of the Trump campaign. For months, the strategy was simple. Let Trump be Trump. The rallies were the engine, the social media posts were the fuel, and the mainstream media's constant attention was the exhaust that propelled the machine forward. It was chaotic, yes, but it was a controlled chaos, or so they thought. Advisors believed that the sheer force of his personality could overwhelm any opponent, and for a time, that calculation seemed politically sound. The base was energized, the donations were flowing, and the opposition seemed flummoxed. However, as any seasoned political operative will tell you, a campaign is a marathon, not a sprint, and the rules change once you enter the final stretch. The general election demands a level of discipline that a primary fight simply does not. You need to appeal to the independents, the suburban voters, the Reagan Democrats, who might be willing to come back into the fold. This requires a calibrated message, a focus on policy, and, above all, a temperament that projects stability and leadership. And it is precisely here, in the realm of temperament, that the wheels have begun to come off. The staff, according to our sources, is watching in horror as the candidate's undisciplined moments threaten to overshadow weeks of careful groundwork. We are hearing reports of specific incidents, quiet moments behind closed doors, where the tension has become almost unbearable. There was the time a senior aide carefully explained the political ramifications of a particular policy stance, only to have Trump dismiss it entirely because of a segment he had seen on Fox News minutes earlier. There was the donor meeting that went sideways when the former president veered off script into a personal grievance, leaving the high-dollar contributors looking at each other in stunned silence. These are not just hiccups, they are symptoms of a deeper operational fracture, a campaign that is being pulled in two directions: the strategic path laid out by professionals and the instinctual path favored by the candidate. This is where the George Will warning becomes so profoundly resonant. Will's analysis isn't about the horse race, it's about the character of the horse. He argues that the Republican Party, in embracing Trump, has made a deal with the devil, trading its long-held principles for short-term electoral gains. And now, Will suggests, the bill is coming due. The very traits that made Trump a disruptive force in 2016, the impulsiveness, the pugilistic nature, the refusal to play by the rules, are now, in the context of a mature campaign, becoming liabilities that his own staff is desperately trying to mitigate. It's a paradox that lies at the heart of this entire drama. To truly grasp the depth of the staff's concern, one must look at the mechanics of the modern campaign trail. It is a finely tuned orchestra, where every note is planned, every beat is choreographed for the evening news. But what happens when the conductor refuses to follow the score? We are learning that advance teams, the unsung heroes of political logistics, are now working double time, not just to manage crowds, but to manage the candidate's exposure to potential triggers. Certain topics are being buried in briefing memos, placed below the fold in the hope that they won't catch his eye. It's a game of political Tetris, and the blocks are falling faster than they can stack them. This interventionist approach by the staff is a direct response to what pollsters are seeing in the data. The internal numbers, we are told, are flashing red in key suburban districts, particularly among college-educated women. These are the voters who may have appreciated the tax cuts or the judicial appointments, but are now expressing deep reservations about the chaos that seems to follow the candidate. They are turned off by the personal attacks, the late-night social media tirades, the general sense of unrest. And when they turn away, the path to 270 electoral votes becomes a treacherous, uphill climb. The staff knows this, and their interventions are a desperate attempt to build a bridge to these voters before it's too late. George Will, with his characteristic precision, has put his finger on this exact point. In his recent commentary, he has dissected what he calls the intellectual vacuity of the current political moment, arguing that the Republican Party has abandoned its role as a serious governing entity. He laments the loss of the policy-heavy debates of yesteryear, replaced by a politics of grievance and personality. For Will, a man who cut his teeth during the Cold War, arguing about the nuances of missile defense, watching the modern discourse devolve into name-calling is not just disappointing, it is an existential threat to the Republic. His alarm is the sound of a once great institution realizing it has lost its way. The historical context here is impossible to ignore. Think back to previous campaigns where the candidate and the staff found themselves at odds. We saw hints of it with Bob Dole in '96, who often felt constrained by the consultants around him. We saw it more dramatically with Hillary Clinton in 2016, whose campaign was famously divided between the digital-first crowd and the old guard. But in those cases, the tension was about strategy. What we are witnessing now is different. This is a tension about basic behavioral control. It is staffers trying to prevent their own candidate from self-immolating on live television or in a 2 a.m. social media post. The stakes are exponentially higher, and the former president's reaction to this management is, by all accounts, volcanic. He didn't build a multi-billion-dollar brand and win the presidency by listening to people who told him to be quiet. He won by being loud, by being disruptive, by being the bull in the china shop. So when his staff now approaches him with furrowed brows and cautious words, suggesting he tone it down, his instinct is to see it as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of the very formula that made him a star. This creates a vicious cycle. The more they try to control him, the more he rebels, and the more he rebels, the more they feel the need to control him. This internal drama is playing out against a backdrop of immense global instability. Wars in Europe and the Middle East, economic uncertainty, and a border crisis dominate the headlines. In a normal election, a challenger would be salivating at the chance to focus on these issues, to paint the incumbent as weak and ineffective. But instead, the headlines are being consumed by the candidate's own behavior. The staff's frustration is palpable. They see a winning hand being thrown away, card by card, because the principal cannot resist the urge to play every single one, even the losers. The opportunity cost of these distractions is, in the eyes of campaign professionals, nothing short of tragic. George Will sees this missed opportunity and weeps for what it means for conservatism. He envisions a Republican Party that could be mounting a serious intellectual challenge to the progressive agenda, offering alternative visions on education, energy, and the economy. Instead, he sees a party wholly consumed by one man's personality. Will's alarm is not just about Trump, it is about the wasteland that has been created around him, a wasteland where serious policy thinkers have been exiled and replaced by loyalists and entertainers. For Will, the party has become a personality cult, and personality cults, as history shows, have a nasty habit of ending badly. The adults in the room narrative is an old one in Trump world, dating back to the early days of his presidency when generals like John Kelly and Jim Mattis were supposed to provide the guardrails. But those adults eventually left, often disillusioned and publicly critical. Now, we are seeing a new generation of staffers attempting to fill that role, but they are doing so from a position of significantly less power. They don't have the moral authority of a four-star general. They are political operatives trying to manage a force of nature with a hurricane. And as any meteorologist will tell you, you don't manage a hurricane. You just try to survive it. What does this management look like in practice? It's the small, almost imperceptible decisions that accumulate into a strategy. It's the staffer who forgets to put a certain newspaper in the briefing folder. It's the aide who schedules a phone call with a friendly ally to distract from a negative news cycle. It's the advisor who carefully words a memo to make a particular course of action seem like it was the candidate's own idea. It is political puppetry of the highest order, but the puppet is 6'3", has a massive platform, and is fully capable of cutting his own strings at any moment. The stress on these staffers must be unimaginable, and the candidate's instincts are not always wrong. In fact, that's what makes the staff's job so difficult. His political gut, honed by years in the media glare and on the campaign trail, is often right on target. He can sense the mood of a crowd, identify a weakness in an opponent, and deliver a message that resonates with his base in a way that no focus group-tested consultant ever could. The problem, from the staff's perspective, is that his gut is just as likely to lead him into a swamp of self-inflicted controversy. It's a high-risk, high-reward game, and right now, the risk-reward ratio is looking dangerously skewed. George Will would argue that this reliance on gut over substance is the fundamental flaw. In his view, a political movement cannot be sustained on adrenaline and anger alone. Eventually, you have to govern. You have to pass legislation. You have to manage a bureaucracy. And the skills required for that are the opposite of the skills required to rile up a crowd at a rally. Will's warning is that the party is becoming structurally incapable of governance, having outsourced all its thinking to a single individual whose primary interest is himself. This, in the long run, is a recipe for electoral extinction, as the party becomes increasingly out of touch with the practical realities of running a country. The diplomatic community is watching this unfold with a mixture of alarm and bewilderment. Ambassadors and foreign ministers who cut their teeth dealing with predictable, if adversarial, American administrations are now faced with the prospect of a foreign policy driven by whim and personal grievance. They read the cables about the campaign infighting, they hear the whispers of the staff interventions, and they wonder what it would mean for NATO, for trade, for the global order, if the restraints were to fail entirely. The stakes of this internal campaign drama are not just domestic, they are global. The world is holding its breath, watching to see if the guardrails will hold. One has to wonder about the psychological toll on the staff. These are people who have dedicated their careers to public service and political advocacy. They believe in their candidate, or at least in the policies he represents. Yet, they find themselves spending more time managing his mood than managing the country's business. They are constantly walking on eggshells, constantly calculating the emotional impact of every piece of news. It is a recipe for burnout, for turnover, and for the kind of quiet desperation that leads to leaks. And indeed, the fact that we are hearing these details at all suggests that the dam is starting to crack. The contrast with previous presidents is stark. Imagine a staffer trying to manage Ronald Reagan. The Gipper was famously disciplined, sticking to his script and his principles, trusting his team to execute the vision. Imagine trying it with George H.W. Bush, a man of such extensive government experience that he was arguably more knowledgeable than his entire staff combined. Even Bill Clinton, for all his personal chaos, was a policy wonk who delighted in deep dives on complex issues. The current dynamic is unprecedented in modern American political history. It is a campaign being run around the candidate, not by him. George Will's long view of history gives his warning a particular weight. He remembers Barry Goldwater's landslide loss in 1964, which many wrote off as the death of conservatism. But he also remembers how that loss seeded the ground for Reagan's rise 16 years later. He knows that political movements are not linear. They have cycles of death and rebirth. His fear, articulated in his recent writings, is that the current iteration of the party is not just losing an election, but is so thoroughly discrediting the conservative brand that it will take a generation to recover. The alarm he is sounding is for the long-term health of the body politic. Back inside the campaign, the tension is manifesting in the smallest of ways. The body language in the hallways is said to be rigid. Conversations stop abruptly when certain people enter the room. There is a palpable lack of trust. The candidate, sensing he is being managed, is increasingly turning to a small coterie of outside voices, family members, old friends, media personalities, who tell him what he wants to hear. This creates a parallel structure, an unofficial shadow campaign that operates without any regard for the strategic plan. And it is this shadow campaign, unpredictable and unaccountable, that terrifies the official staff the most. This shadow campaign is a nightmare for communications directors. Imagine crafting a meticulous message for the day, getting it approved, coordinating surrogates, and prepping the candidate, only to have him go on a late-night phone call with a friend who convinces him to throw it all out the window and focus on a decades-old grievance instead. The discipline of a modern campaign relies on a single source of truth, a unified command. When that unity is shattered, the message becomes garbled, the press becomes confused, and the voters become disengaged. It is a communications catastrophe in slow motion. And the media, of course, is lapping it up. Every leak, every whisper of discontent, every behind-the-scenes drama becomes a headline. The very chaos the staff is trying to contain is the fuel that keeps the 24-hour news cycle burning. It's a paradox that is not lost on the operatives involved. They need the media to spread their message, but the media is far more interested in covering the infighting than the policy. The candidate, a master media manipulator, seems to understand this on a cellular level. He knows that chaos gets clicks, and for him, attention, good or bad, has always been the ultimate currency. George Will, however, draws a sharp distinction between attention and respect. He has watched as the dignity of the presidency, an office he has spent a lifetime studying and venerating, has been diminished by the constant churn of scandal and controversy. For Will, the presidency is not just a job. It is a sacred trust, an institution that represents the American people to the world. To see it reduced to the level of a reality show, to see the nation's business conducted via impulsive social media posts is, in his eyes, a desecration. His warning is not just political, it is deeply, profoundly philosophical. The operational details we are piecing together paint a picture of a campaign in a state of high anxiety. Travel logistics are a nightmare because the candidate's schedule is subject to change based on his mood. Fundraising calls are being rescheduled because the principal isn't feeling it. Interview prep sessions, known as murder boards in the trade, are being cut short because the candidate refuses to be grilled by his own staff. Every single operational aspect of the campaign is being touched by this underlying instability. It is like trying to build a house on a foundation of jelly. What happens when the foundation finally gives way? That is the question keeping Republican strategists awake at night. A candidate who feels unsupported by his staff, who feels they are holding him back, may eventually decide to blow the whole thing up. A dramatic staff purge, a public feud with his own advisors, or a series of unhinged public appearances could tank the campaign overnight. The very interventions designed to save him could be the trigger that sets him off. It is a catch-22 of epic political proportions, a lose-lose scenario where every move carries the risk of catastrophe. George Will, in his inimitable style, has articulated this paradox better than anyone. He argues that the party is trapped. It cannot live with Trump because of the chaos and the damage to the brand, but it cannot live without him because he has so thoroughly consumed the base that any alternative would be seen as a betrayal. It is a classic hostage situation, where the hostage taker has also become the only person keeping the hostages alive. Will's alarm is the sound of someone watching a tragedy unfold, knowing exactly how it ends, but being powerless to stop it. Let's look at the historical parallels. Think of Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968, a political titan brought low by a war he couldn't win and a party he couldn't unite. Think of Richard Nixon in 1974, whose staff spent their days trying to contain a paranoid and increasingly unstable president. The parallels are not exact, of course, but the underlying dynamic, a staff working overtime to manage a leader whose judgment they no longer trust, is a recurring theme in the downfall of political giants. It is a dynamic that history tells us almost never ends well for anyone involved. The financial implications are also starting to pile up. Major donors, the kind who write seven-figure checks, are not fans of chaos. They like stability, predictability, and a clear path to victory. When they read headlines about staff intervention and internal dysfunction, they get nervous. And when donors get nervous, they stop writing checks. The campaign's finance operation is reportedly working overtime to reassure deep-pocketed supporters that everything is under control, that the ship is being steered. But the leaks and the rumors are making that job increasingly difficult. The money could dry up, and without money, a modern campaign is dead in the water. The candidate, for his part, seems almost oblivious to these financial concerns, or perhaps he just doesn't care. He has always prided himself on being cheap, on running a lean operation, on getting free media attention that money can't buy. He views the donor class with suspicion, seeing them as part of the swamp he was elected to drain. This fundamental distrust between the candidate and the financial engine of his own party is yet another layer of dysfunction. The staff is caught in the middle, trying to bridge a gap that seems to widen every day. And what of the voters, the millions of Americans who will ultimately decide this election? They see the rallies, they see the headlines, But do they see the dysfunction? Political science tells us that most voters are not paying close attention to the day-to-day operations of a campaign. They form impressions based on the candidate's demeanor, his message, and his performance in debates. The danger for Trump is that the chaos behind the scenes will eventually bleed into his public performance. The exhaustion, the frustration, the sense of being hemmed in, it will show. And voters, particularly those undecided ones, can smell desperation.